H17A ACE class this fall. So this one will be covering Native Americans, and it'll generally cover some of the information that Taylor talks about in chapter 1, but of course I'll give it a different twist. I'm not just going to regurgitate what he said. How boring is that? To do well with these questions, make sure you include both what you read in chapter 1 and what I'll talk about here in the lecture. Okay, so number 2, number 4, number 5 I'll cover. I'll talk about the Aztecs, how they influenced North America, some positive and negative aspects of horticulture, and then for number 5 I'll talk briefly about the Cahokia and compare them to the California Indians. First of all, let me get this technology right. Let's take a look at 1492 in the world, the year Columbus sailed the ocean blue. The Earth, we estimate, had about 500 million people, and the Americas had about 60 million. And the concentration of peoples in the Americas was right in the middle. Mesoamerica, we call it, or Middle America. We estimate about 30 million, North America 5, South America 15. But you know what? Science changes. What archaeologists are finding now through looking at, well, since there's not much of a rainforest as there used to be, they're finding a lot more archaeological remains and evidence of more people living in the Amazon than we previously thought. So numbers are going to probably rise about how many first Americans lived in South America. I think this is a cool map showing the first North Americans. It shows you the diversity of them. It separates them into, 6 different ecological and cultural groups, the southeast, eastern woodlands, etc. You have names that you might identify with, your grandfather's RV. I see Winnebago, there's the Kickapoo, the Missouri, the Iowa, the Toledo. These are all names of first Americans. And this is just a partial list of names. There's many, many more. This is just to give you an idea of the diversity of the first North Americans. And as I said, we're still finding things out. Science is sort of an evolving and moving forward process of knowing what we don't know. Just recently, DNA folks at MIT University found that about 30% of all the dogs in North America have genetic traces of some of the first American dogs that migrated with the first Americans, 10 to 40,000 years ago. So these are just variants of these dogs that have Native American lineages in them. So, what are the positive and negative aspects of horticulture? Well, unlike what traditionally people have thought about the first Americans, the Native Americans, they didn't live in harmony with the environment and just singing Kumbaya around the fire. They managed and manipulated their landscape, perhaps not to the extent, some of them did it to the extent of the Europeans, but it just depended on where. For example, the natives that Columbus met did not alter their landscape all that much, except for in what we see today's Haiti. If you see the island in the Caribbean, it has a checkerboard thing. That means they used fire in the dry season to kick back a lot of the vegetation. So the first Americans used various forms of land management, from landscaping to irrigation systems, terracing of fields, and raised fields, and they used fire. So far be it from just at one with nature, they definitely managed nature as best they could, not always in successful ways, but they were successful often. The Americans managed their landscape and they domesticated various foods, the most important of which for Middle America was corn, and the development of Middle American corn went up to North America. Beans, potatoes are from South America, and the first Americans also domesticated dogs and bees, but as you can tell, they didn't domesticate any large animals. There wasn't any horses, cows, goats, pigs that the Near East, Europe, and Africa domesticated. Okay. I'm just putting the Americans the first Americans in the context of what the other folks during the agricultural revolutions were accomplishing. Let me give you probably the most stark example of how Native Americans manage the landscape, and this is in South America, what's currently Peru. Here are some terraced farmings. These are in the Andes Mountains, and they're utilizing the steep slopes and they're making use of these steep slopes in which they planted potatoes, corn, beans. And some of these slopes actually date to 1,500 years ago. It wasn't like this 1,500 years ago, but it's been in continual use for about 1,500 years, and many folks are still using similar drainage irrigation systems and terracing. Here's an old, this comes from a book by an artist named Juan Boma. He did this in the 1530s. He wanted to show the King of Spain that yes, indeed, the Inca were sophisticated. So here he is showing 3 different pictures of cultivating potatoes. On the left, they're digging the holes. Man's digging the holes. Woman's putting the seed in. This gender division of labor is pretty interesting. And in the middle, they're harvesting. Right? Again, you have the man digging the hole to bring the potato up, the woman down harvesting, and a porter taking it away. And on the right-hand side, you see the impact of the irrigation system, right? Irrigating the fields. So the first Americans, especially the Inca, the Aztecs, and a few others, developed very sophisticated agricultural systems. Let's move to Middle America. And I know this is class about U.S. history, but we have to look about how these major population centers of Middle America did come to impact North America. Middle America, we have the Aztecs and the Maya. They're probably the most famous and the ones I'll focus on briefly here. The Middle Americans were unique amongst all the Native Americans because they developed a writing language. They were one of 5 human civilizations to develop writing. The others were in India, China, today's Iraq, and I'm forgetting one. And in Egypt. This is interesting because on one hand there's phonetic symbols, so you read it as we would read the word original. We know the letters O-I-R-G make the orig sound. So there's elements of that in this writing, but there's also elements of pictographs in which you see a picture and you know what that symbolizes. Like we have on our bathroom doors an image of a stick with a triangle, and that's generally a woman's bathroom, and then a human just with arms and legs and no triangle in the middle, that's a man's bathroom. So this is an example of a pictograph in our language. And if you were able to read Maya, you could read about the conquests and how wonderful the kings were in this one image here. The Aztecs also had writing. All these Middle American people have writing. Let me just give you a brief look about where the Aztecs lived. It's rather stunning. They lived in a valley that was 7,000 feet up in the air, surrounded by, it was a big high valley, surrounded by these big mountains. Here's Mount Popocatépetl, the smoking mountain. Of course, in Mexico, everything has nicknames, so this one's just called Popo. This one is smoking. It's been smoking since at least 400 AD, according to Aztec chroniclers. And here's Iztaccíhuatl. It's Nahua for the sleeping lady. If you can tell, her head's on the left, her breast and torso in the middle, and her feet are on the right-hand side of the mountain. Just to give you an idea of the Middle American landscape. So who are the Aztecs? The Aztecs migrated. It took them 300-400 years to migrate from northern parts of Mexico down to the Central Valley of Mexico, which was an ideal spot for them. It was just, let me show you where they came from. They came from upper left-hand corner of the map of Mexico and migrated down to the Central Valley. Rich and fertile soils. The climate was calm. And they transformed from nomads to city slickers quite rapidly. Here's an image of them. They were called the Chichimecas by their enemies when they first arrived. That means the dog people. But they soon found their way and developed this really sophisticated civilization. In the early 1300s, they founded their capital. You might recognize this image. This image of the eagle is on the middle of the Aztec calendar. They called their capital Tenochtitlan, the place of the cactus. And if you were able to read Nahua, that's the language of the Aztecs, you'd be able to read the pictographs surrounding this map, and it would tell you a brief history about the Aztecs and how they got there and who was ruling them and who they conquered. If you can see below in the image, you see the conquest it took for them to get their little piece of land in the middle of the lake. When they arrived, the only jobs they could get, because they were good at it, they were good at fighting from their hundreds of years of nomadic life from the north going south, they sold themselves out as mercenaries to the local, more powerful sedentary folks. And they got good at it. And pretty soon, their empire grew, their alliances grew, they grew through marriages, much like European power structures or others. This is an Aztec drawing. All these old images I'm showing you are from the Aztec hand, dating from the 15 and 1600s. This one is a painting of an Aztec wedding. An Aztec wedding, you can tell the mujer and the bride and groom at the top are getting married, and it's translated later into Spanish. So when the Spanish came and conquered, they would be able to read this Aztec drawing. You have comida in the middle, that's the words above the foods in the middle. And this is, of course, for a wealthy couple's wedding. They wouldn't bother to draw a peasant's or a poor family's wedding. So the empire grew through marriages, through alliances, and, of course, through conquest. And pretty soon, the Aztec Empire created a social contract. Like we have a social contract. We have duties we're supposed to give to our government, and our government today is supposed to in turn give us protection, etc. Well, for the Aztecs, the subjects were supposed to be loyal, pay a tax, fight for them, and in turn, the Aztec state was supposed to sponsor festivals where everybody would eat a lot and have honey and chocolate and get drunk once in a while. Alcohol was strictly regulated and was allowed only on certain festival days for the everyday peasant. So you could do these at these many festivals. But other than that, no. The Aztecs were highly regulated civilization. The state also allowed you to have local control as long as the subjects were loyal, pay tax, and fought. But other than that, they would give you little in return. There wasn't garbage service, there wasn't educational service, there wasn't much else in return, and many folks who came under the Aztec umbrella weren't really happy about it. We'll see how that plays out later. So here's a map of the extent of the Aztec Empire, all just the non-brown colors. All those colorful stuff in the middle is the extent of their growth by 1519, the height of their growth, right when the Spanish was coming in. Right when the Spanish came in. And by 1519, there was about 250,000 Nahua-speaking Aztec people on this island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. And there's about 1 million people in the surrounding basin. Okay. This island, you can see the streets are waterways. Right? This is why when the first Spanish came, he called it Little Venice. The island in the middle of this brine lake, as you can guess, was the Aztecs settled there because when they first got there, they were not very welcomed. So they needed a place that offered them safety and security for their numerous enemies who were on the shore. So they went into this small little snake-infested island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, and they ended up building all these aqueducts because you can't drink that water, it's brine, it's like Salt Lake. You can't drink that water, so they would build aqueducts and roadways that would connect the mainland to their Aztec capital. As with any large civilization throughout world history, they were made to pay taxes, the Aztec subjects. This is an example of what two towns had to pay. Okay, one town's on the left, one town's on the right. The town on the right had to give an eagle every 80 days, and this would go into Montezuma's aviary. The king of the Aztecs, Montezuma, had quite a large aviary in which he also had a zoo with jaguars and turtles and all these exotic American animals. But as you can tell on the tax sheet were also outfits, and those funny looking outfits that might look like Halloween costumes. To us, these were actually what the warriors wore. These were like their special agents. And on the bottom of the screen, you can see those are just more everyday corn, beans, that they also had to pay to keep the city of Tenochtitlan of 250,000 fed. So Aztecs paid taxes as well. They also wrote poetry, and what this tells you is they were big enough and sophisticated enough where some folks didn't do anything but just hang out and be artists. Like Nezahualcoyotl, that means he who hears the coyote. Coyotl means coyote. This is our English language word for that little dog out there that eats smaller poodles, comes from Nahua, Nezahualcoyotl. So you'd see the poet being spoken to by a coyote figure right here. And this is just an example of some Nahua poetry that was translated in the early 1900s. Our house on earth we do not inhabit, only borrow it briefly. So be splendid princes. Here only our heart sings, briefly lent to one another. Earth is not our last home, so take these flowers and be splendid princes, be splendid. It's quite something, isn't it? Beautiful. There you go. Go ahead and woo your partner with some Aztec poetry. Here's a much better view. This is a rendition done by an artist who did a lot of homework historically to get as accurate a rendition of the Aztec capital before the Spanish came as he could. Hundreds of miles of reservoirs. This is the reservoir over here holding up the lake. See it over here on the right. Okay, miles of aqueducts and canals connecting the Aztec island with the mainland in this huge valley surrounded by all these 12,000, 14,000 foot volcanoes. It's quite a stunning place. Today, this is Mexico City. How did they feed all these folks? Well, in early Mexico, about 5,000 BC, long before the Aztecs or the Maya, early Middle Americans came up with complementary farming. They figured out if they took this little grass and took it to the biggest seed and took the bigger seed, and the bigger seed they genetically modified it, not in any lab, but just by choosing the biggest seed, planting that. The Aztecs eventually, let me just show you this map, this thing of the corn. The Aztecs eventually took these little grass seed and came up with all these variations of corn and planted them and domesticated this grass. Corn cannot grow without the help of humans. There is no wild corn. You have to take the husk off and plant it yourself. What the early Middle Americans also figured out was that if you complement corns with beans with squash, it gives you complete protein and it's a complete amino acid complement to each other. So you're not going to get big and strong, but it'll keep you alive. Of course you can get big and strong. What am I saying? I'll take that back. So corn, beans, and squash, complete protein, amino acids. And here's how they would grow it. You would plant the squash and the corn right next to it. The corn would grow up. The beans, they're not showing the beans, but the beans would go around the corn stalk. And the idea is the squash leaves protect the ground from the sun so the ground doesn't dry up as quickly, right? So you're keeping hydration in. And you have the squash here, the corn up there, and the beans, which give nitrates to the soil, actually fertilizing the soil as they produce beans. It's a brilliant system. They call it the milpa system, and it's actually making a comeback in many urban gardens in the United States. The Aztecs also came up with this, they're not the originators of it, but they used human sewage in the cities. Each town block, let me show you the town block. Each town block at the end of it would have a little outhouse in which literally you would take your human waste, do your business, it would go into a canoe, and then they would put cattle on top of it to kill all the bacteria, and they would utilize the human fertilizer for their gardens. Right? Pretty brilliant. A lot cleaner than what they were doing with the human waste in European cities, chucking it into the streets. Here they would reuse it after killing all the bacteria and use it as fertilizer. And their agricultural revolution came up with tomatles, aguacatles, you know those as tomatoes and avocados. Middle Americans also ate pumpkins and chilies. Vanilla comes from Middle America. There was no tomatoes, avocados, pumpkins, chilies, and vanilla in the rest of the world until after 1519, when Europeans brought these items back to Europe and the rest of the world. The Aztecs did domesticate and eat turkeys, ducks, dogs, and honey. Just to give you an idea of their food. And chocolatl. This is another Nahua word. Here's a chocolatl barista making her frothy chocolate. Right? And ever since then, the world's been in love with chocolate. When the Spanish first brought it over in the 1520s back to Europe, it was a hit right away. The early recipes included chili, vanilla, added with a little honey, and then Europeans turned it and made it their own. All these goods were traded on market day in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. Here's a stylized painting from the 1930s of a Aztec market, but you get the idea. You can buy the little chihuahuas. Here's some chihuahuas, which are dogs. They're early warning systems, but they're also good eating, right? If it's in a pinch and you get hungry, a little chihuahua taco. These dogs had actually kept the Spanish alive when they were going through, and especially when they were starving on their way into Mexico City in the early 1500s. This was the biggest market in the world at this time, 60,000 people on market day. The biggest city in Europe at this time was 30,000. So imagine that, on market day in Tenochtitlan, it was twice as big as any city Europeans have seen. The Aztec did jade work. Look at this magnificent jade work. Right, this is a funerary mask that was placed on a deceased king before he was buried. Here's a Quetzalcoatl, a snake image. Right, those are actually teeth from an animal. I don't know which, but the green is jade. And you know what's interesting? I show you this not only to show you how cool the Aztecs artisan were and to show you how wealthy and sophisticated they were to do such things like this, but also the jade. We went, and people who studied this, geologists went and found out the jade fingerprint, microbial fingerprint of this, and found that it comes from the U.S. Southwest, right, the Arizona, New Mexico area. Similarly, the Aztecs valued feathers from this quetzal bird. Very, very much so valued feathers, as much as the Europeans valued gold. These feathers were priceless to Aztec nobility. These come from Guatemala. Well, what does that tell you? That the jade comes from the Southwest, the quetzal feathers come from Guatemala. There's a sophisticated network of trading going on before the Europeans come. These are just, I wish this map stretched down into Middle America, but it doesn't. But you can tell how there's arrows going down. So imagine, right in here is where jade would be harvested and traded down to Middle America for other goods, right? They would export jade and import other goods from Middle America. Pretty cool, huh? Jade, so it would be one of the southwestern peoples. We guess it was the Hohokam, but we're not sure about where the jade, I'm not sure about which actual people they traded the jade with. So, first Americans trade. We see the people way down here in 13, 14, 1500s trading with North America, and then especially with Eastern North America, and I'll talk about that